So, the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix was, I think, both a mix of really fun weekend with not as good when you actually look at it, but not necessarily when you actually drill down into it. So, the exciting part came from qualifying, where we had a pretty solid session of qualifying. Q1, nothing super exciting happened. The five that were knocked out in Q1 were Yuki Tsunoda, Alex Albon, Nick DeVries, Lando Norris, and Logan Sargent. Sargent was particularly frustrating for me because there was the whole track limits thing on a corner where the wall was, I think, 5 inches of the white line. So that was a bit frustrating. I think he would have done very well with his original time had it been allowed in. So it is what it is on that one. But Lando Norris had a bit of an issue. I believe he tapped the wall and had a bit of a nightmare. So he started all the way down in P19. But all in all, a very fun Q1 just from a track limits discussion perspective, as well as a McLaren boat racing hilarity continued from Bahrain not but a couple of weeks ago. So if we take a look all in all, if we want to say biggest winners from qualifying this past weekend, I think the biggest winners honestly are probably that's a great question. Oscar Piastri, a good winner, I would say, really showing his mettle after a horrific showing in Bahrain, just from a McLaren just absolutely in the mud scenario, responding beautifully and getting into Q3. Now, to be said, people were saying the only reason he made it into Q3 was because a certain Max Verstappen had a drive shaft failure in Q2 and actually finished qualifying P15 in the last position out in Q2. So that was a big moment in qualifying for sure, as a lot of people suddenly kind of perked up. I know I was definitely one of them, and all of a sudden potentially having a very, very fun race weekend ahead. I don't think any of us had any dreams or aspirations of, Verstappen not being on the podium, but at least it was not a wire to wire Red Bull 1-2, which I think a lot of people were fully expecting after the first weekend in Bahrain. So there is that. Putting my Haas hat on, really close to getting a Haas into Q3. Nico Hulkenberg finishes in P11, where he was not but 0.04 of a second behind Pierre Gasly in P10 and making it through. So both Haas is out of Q2, but I think a much better showing from Kevin Magnussen, who qualified P13 as well and not getting knocked out in Q1 like it was in Bahrain. So a very, very much better day for Haas, who still have a long way to go, but at least it wasn't a total stinker from tip to tail. Let's see, taking a look around the rest of Q3. I think Q3, I think there was a moment where all of us kind of were perked up after Q2 with Verstappen retiring, but that was quickly dashed when I believe Checo's first lap was about 5/10 clear of P2, and all of us kind of realized, all right, we're fighting for that second spot on the front row rather than the top spot. Of course, looming for Ferrari is Charles Leclerc's 10th place grid penalty for taking a new control electronics, already exhausting 2 out of 2 given in a season in 1 round in Bahrain. So unfortunate for them, but he did end up qualifying P2, but started P12 on the day. Pardon. So not a great showing from everyone else. Fernando Alonso ends up starting on the front row next to Checo after Charles's grid penalty is applied. George Russell out qualifies Carlos Sainz. Lance Stroll out qualifies Esteban Ocon and Lewis Hamilton, which I think Lewis has just really struggled to to get grips with the W14, and it will be interesting to see what that car looks like here in a few weeks, to say the least. So the ultimately the starting order ended up being, if I take a look here, it ended up being Checo starting on pole, Fernando Alonso, George Russell and Carlos Sainz, Lance Stroll, Esti Besti, Ocon, Lewis Hamilton, Oscar Piastri, Pierre Gasly, and then Nico Hulkenberg actually ends up starting in P10 after Charles gets knocked below him. So a very, very fun race awaited us, with Max having to make his way through 15 potential grid positions to end up having a shot to win the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And I think I posted this in the Discord, but I think I put in there that I had Max leading the race by lap 30. It ended up not being true, but he was in P2 by lap 25, so I think that's still pretty close. I'm gonna give myself half points on that one. So we had a bit of drama as well. Fernando Alonso led into turn 1 and 2, getting a better reaction on Sergio Perez off the line. I think that was a very, very fun one, but it was quickly dashed, not by a lap or so later, when we found out that Fernando was hit with a 5-second penalty for a starting box infraction, similar to Esteban Ocon in Bahrain, and so he had his 5-second penalty applied to that, but thankfully was able to be served under a safety car, which came, it was around lap 20-ish, something like that, thanks to Lance Stroll's retirement. So there was some more drama about that, and we'll cover that I think here in a little bit. But all in all, taking a look at the rest of the race, post safety car, I think kind of gave everyone a bit of false hope when it came to the potential for some drama. That said, all it really did was allow everyone to kind of get a free change of tires, and we saw a lot of the lack of pace kind of come out in a lot of different teams. And so it ended up bunching everyone back up, but at the same time, I don't think it was as dramatic as we all would have loved it to be. Moving on from there, a special shout out goes to McLaren, who both drivers had to pit at the beginning of the race thanks to some damage. I think Oscar Piastri lost his front wing in turn 2, coming out of turn 2. And then Lando, we never saw exactly where Lando lost his, but he ended up pitting, I believe, on lap 3. And so that put both McLarens down near the bottom once again, and McLaren fans are, in fact, in the mud. Looking forward from there, we had 2 DNFs from this race. We had Alex Albon, who had a bit of a weird brake failure happen, where he reported no brakes, but continued on for an extra lap anyway. I think a lot of us were very confused when Williams had him go around one more time before ultimately retiring. And Lance Stroll ends up retiring. I don't believe I saw exactly why Lance retired, but he was basically told to pull over and retire the car fairly early in the first 20 laps, which triggered a maybe not warranted, but the safety car that did end up coming out. So a bit of a tough day from Williams and Lance, who was doing actually fairly well. I really feel bad for Alex Albon, who was kind of running around just outside the points. Really might have been in position to take advantage of any other miscues from those in the points, but ultimately brake failure will keep him out of the points. So looking at the final results, we have Sergio Perez ends up winning. Max Verstappen comes in P2 and with the fastest lap point, which will be big. We'll cover that here in a moment. And then Fernando Alonso, and let's go ahead and we'll move into the big conspiracy of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix weekend, which was Fernando Alonso finishes on the road in P3 on the podium. And it's something that kind of came out of nowhere, which I think it was somewhere around like 7-ish laps remaining. All of a sudden we see come over the radio, the Mercedes team come over the radio to George, saying that they need to push as they believe Fernando might have a 5-second penalty. And of course, all of us watching were very confused, as nothing had really happened to show this in any kind of way. And so they end up doing the pushing. Fernando ends up building enough of a gap, the 5-second gap mentioned over the radio, and ends up finishing with a big enough gap. But it does come out that apparently Fernando Alonso did not serve his penalty correctly, similar to Esteban Ocon in Bahrain, and so Alonso was post-race given a 10-second penalty for his rear jack operator in his pit crew for touching the car and working on the car during his penalty 5-second window, and so he was given an additional 10-second penalty, which dropped him below George Russell, promoting George up onto the podium after the race was ending. And there was a lot of controversy around that. As we saw in Bahrain, Esteban Ocon was given all of his penalties effectively immediately after they happened, and so a lot of the controversy kind of came around by everyone going, well, you had 35 laps to assess this penalty, why all of a sudden after the race is this penalty being given? And there was a lot of hubbub about it, and everyone kind of just was frustrated, but ultimately moved on, except for Aston Martin, who went to the FIA and the stewards and got the penalty reverted not but a handful of hours later, and reinstituted Fernando back into P3 well after I think everyone had kind of moved on. So it was a very odd situation. I think we'll probably be seeing some clarification on what the definition of doing work on the car truly means, because there very much seem to be semantics, and if I had to guess, it definitely has a lot of Mercedes hands written all over it, trying to squeeze every last point they could out of this race. But ultimately it was for naught, as Fernando finishes on the podium in P3. So it was a fun race. It was an interesting race in terms of, I think the lower battles ended up being a lot more interesting, as there were battles happening in the midfield and the lower midfield. Other than that, there's not a whole lot that really went on near the top. Once Checo and Max kind of broke away from everyone else, they kind of just left that alone, potentially, except for right at the very end, where there was some potential drama around the communication between the two Red Bull drivers about holding position, pushing versus not, what target lap times are, and a lot of that. So it ultimately ended up not mattering, except with Max Verstappen ended up getting the fastest lap point on the final lap of the Grand Prix. Max Verstappen continues to lead the World Drivers' Championship by a single point, as when in Bahrain, Max finished first, Checo finished second, but neither had fastest lap. And so this result was going to come down to whoever finished with the fastest lap was going to be leading the championship. And Max apparently taking matters into his own hands and taking the fastest lap on the final lap, and continuing to lead the championship by a single point, which has caused a bit of a weird stir in Red Bull, and it's probably might be the only drama that we're going to get in terms of who wins the championship this year, potentially coming out of the Red Bull camp. But it was a good race. We saw a lot of buddy driving. A lot of the teammates ended up next to each other in the order. We had the Red Bull 1-2, we had a Mercedes 4-5, we had a Ferrari 6-7, we had an Alpine 8-9, we had Yuki Tsunoda broke up the Haas 10-12, and it was just it was very funny to see everyone driving with their partners all the way down the stretch, as we really got a good idea of the pecking order of pace around here. It would be remiss of me not to mention the Haas results, as Kevin Magnussen overtakes Yuki Tsunoda with about 3 laps remaining to secure his first championship point for his season, as well as the first championship point for Haas. So congratulations to Kevin. Haas will not be blanked this year, and hopefully this is a good sign moving forward that Haas can continue building. We've seen the single lap pace that Nico Hülkenberg has had in the Haas car. We have yet to really see him put together a solid race to capitalize, but at the same time, no major bins, no major mistakes, and so far it seems like things are going pretty well for Haas, to say the least. As an American, I'll also give my final shout out to Logan Sargent, who was kind of running up near around points. I think he was in P12 or P13 for most of the evening around Jeddah, but kind of did sort of fall off the pace a little bit as his tires started to go off, and he kind of fell into a battle with the McLarens down the stretch, which was interesting to watch because I think he gave a lot of insight on just how draggy that McLaren is, where Logan Sargent fell out of the DRS range of Nico Hulkenberg and Zhou Guanyu and Nick De Vries, and even down the main start-finish straights, we still couldn't see the McLaren out drag the Williams with DRS down the pit straight. It was very embarrassing for McLaren for sure. With DRS, they still couldn't keep up really with the Williams down that straight. So Piastri did end up getting by Sargent, but I think that's at that point his tires had fallen so far off, and Oscar was on, I believe it was Logan and Lando were both on the mediums, and Oscar was on the hards at that point, which were obviously a much better race tire at that point than the mediums. So it was an interesting one. I mean, ultimately we saw a Red Bull 1-2 just like we all imagined. It kind of just, really came down to who was gonna take the win, and it was Checo who ended up doing everything he needed to do to hold on to the win. So congratulations to Checo. And as we take a look at the driver standings, currently after 2 rounds, Max Verstappen leads 44 points to Sergio Perez's 43 points. Fernando Alonso occupies the 3rd spot with Carlos Sainz and Lewis Hamilton both sitting at 20 points, with George Russell on 18 and 6. We're seeing a lot. I think the only thing we have here is that Fernando Alonso is driving the bolts off of that car, potentially literally, and so we're gonna have to be keeping an eye on that. As for the constructor standings, Mercedes does tie. With George's podium, they would have been ahead, but they currently tied now Aston Martin for P2. So it is Red Bull 87, Aston Martin and Mercedes 38, with Ferrari in 4th with 26, and then Alpine sort of the best of the rest in P5 with 8, and Haas and Williams tied down there in 7th and 8th. AlphaTauri and McLaren yet to score a point, with McLaren occupying the bottom spots. Also, as Sean points out, yes, also a huge congratulations to Fernando Alonso, who becomes the 6th driver ever to have 100 podiums in his Formula 1 career. That 41-year-old is driving the crap out of that car, and I think he's loving everything about it. But that was the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Let me know what you thought of the race in the comment section below, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks for the Australian Grand Prix. I think this one's going to be a lot of fun as well. A good mix of high speed sections with also some really technical sections. Going to be a fun one, but we'll see you guys then.